Hey guys, so we're going to be looking at the sectionalist period in U.S. history, which is what leads us into the Civil War. So it's really important that you understand kind of the differences that were going on between the North and the South and why there was so much tension leading into the Civil War. So the questions that you're going to be asked after this lesson, there's the essential questions that are hanging in the classroom, and then we've got some essential questions with this particular video. How did sectionalism help to shape the development of the Constitution? What compromises did Congress pass in order to lessen sectional conflicts in the early 19th century, which was the 1800s? What roles did John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster play in early 19th century sectional disputes? Number 4, why couldn't politicians formulate a long-term solution to sectional issues? Number 5, how did the issues of sectionalism affect the development of political parties and political theory in the 19th century? Number 6, why did North and South each have such strong misconceptions about the beliefs of the other? And then last, number 7, why did the election of 1860 signal the end of any possible reconciliation between the North and the South? So I've highlighted some of the key vocab that if you aren't familiar with, it would be a good thing to understand. First of all, sectionalism, Constitution, and compromise. Okay, so make sure you're looking those up if you don't have a good background of what those words actually mean. All right, so sectionalism and the Constitution. Now we know that the Constitution is the document that forms the government of the United States. And so you have to keep in mind that at this point the United States is still a really, really young country, and we're trying to figure out how this Constitution is going to work out for us. So Northern delegates, and we've talked about this, wanted slaves to count for taxation purposes, but not for representation purposes. And as we looked at earlier on, the South felt differently. Southern delegates felt that we should count slaves as a part of representation so that you can have more representatives in Congress, not for taxation purposes, because they didn't want to pay that extra money. So that's, of course, a really big difference. And that's why a lot of people say slavery is a big issue that led to the war. And slavery was one of the issues, but there were multiple other issues that led to Civil War as well. So the result of this was the 3/5 compromise, which said that slaves were going to count as 3/5 of a person, not as an entire person when it comes down to representation. Congress agreed that they would not interfere with the slave trade until 1808. So even in the earlier phases of the Constitution, people were having this discussion about slavery. Should it be legal? Should it not be legally? Should we outlaw it in certain territories? But they agreed to table that until later on in the 1800s. Slavery and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the Northwest Ordinance creates 5 new states in the Northwest Territory, which is kind of the area where Ohio is. Slavery and involuntary servitude were prohibited, okay, which kind of conflicts with this up here, which of course is going to make the Southerners really angry. It did not affect the slaves that were already in the Northwest Territory, but it basically said that you cannot bring new slaves into the Northwest Territory. Some people still decided to bring their slaves into the territory, of course, just to test out that law. And it really kind of hinted towards some pressure to continue slavery in the Northwest, even though at the time abolitionists and people in the North did not want slavery to continue. So the differences in the North and the South: the North was primarily industrial, so lots of factories, mostly small farms, not hugely dependent on agriculture. We supported internal improvements up in the North, so things like the creation of roads and bridges and canals. Favored a strong central government, which would have made them similar to the Federalists, and then wanted to limit slavery but favored free labor. So you look at those things, you see slavery and you see free labor, and they kind of sound like the same. So really the backbone of the economy in the North and in the South was dependent on this idea of free labor. And there were some arguments about how that should end up working out in the long run. In the South, primarily agricultural, which means lots of farms, big farms, plantation farms. They oppose the idea of spending tax money in internal improvements, They were for states' rights. They felt like the states should have more power than the federal government. States should be able to decide what they wanted to do with things like slavery. They, of course, relied on slavery. It was the background of their economy. And they wanted to extend slavery into the Western territories because they knew that the Western territories would also be very heavily reliant on agriculture for their economy. So some of the earliest sectional disputes. So Hamilton, who we talked about really briefly, Alexander Hamilton, wanted the government to pay off state war debts, and the North owed 80% of those war debts. So of course the North was really hesitant to pay all of this stuff off. There was a compromise with Jefferson and Madison that located the U.S. Capitol in the South. So Washington, D.C. was considered a U.S. or a Southern territory. There was controversy over the creation of a national bank, which Hamilton also wanted. There was anger over the Alien and Sedition Acts, which led Kentucky to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and we'll look at those more deeply in class so you can have a better understanding of that. And then there was this issue of interposition of state authority over federal law, okay? So that basically meant that there was this theory that, or this issue that there were states who believed that their state government was more important than the federal government as a whole. Okay, that's going to lead to that whole secession issue and the feeling that states should be able to remove themselves from the federal government. We have the Hartford Convention held in 1814 and 1850 by Federalists who opposed the War of 1812. They protested the war, called for constitutional revisions, and raised concerns about secession. Okay, so should the southern states have the right to be able to remove themselves from the federal government? They contended that states could interpose their authority to protect against unfair federal laws, and that's what this was saying up here, that the states could see themselves as being more powerful than the actual federal government. So the treaty ending the war ended the convention's concerns. So with the end of the War of 1812, this whole convention was kind of wiped off the slate because the treaty addressed a lot of the issues that were discussed here. Obviously, the secession talks were coming from the Southerners. And remember that the people who wanted the War of 1812 were the war hawks, and the war hawks were these Southerners who really wanted to add this territory onto the U.S. Okay, so finally we have slavery in the Louisiana Territory, which we know was bought from France in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. States admitted along similar rules as the Northwest Ordinance. There was a lot of debate about what do we do with the slavery issue among these states. Missouri applied for statehood in 1817. Most of the residents of Missouri were slaveholders and Southerners. So admission of Missouri as a slave state would upset the balance between the number of slave and free states. So what's going to happen as a result of this is the Missouri Compromise and the Missouri Compromise line, and we're going to be looking at that when we look at some of the causes of the Civil War. But you can see from all of just these little blips of what I was talking about that there were a lot of issues between the North and the South, and slavery was among the most important of those issues, but there were also a lot of political questions and a lot of just overall, how are we going to run our country? The questions were being asked by all kinds of political leaders. So it's important to keep that in mind as we talk more about sectionalism in class and as we talk more about the Civil War in the future. Y'all have a great one.